Gracie, the little bird with the big voice. One morning in the early springtime, the forest of Vale was waking up fast after a long, hard winter, and something beautiful was happening, just as it did every morning in the forest, even in the deep winter months. The sun was rising up as warmth and glory rays bathed the tops of the trees, bearing down like spotlights on a stage at the morning's performance by the little bird with the very big voice. All in the forest called her Gracie, and little Gracie was so tiny and almost plain compared to the other birds of her kind. She was petite, but with quite a big round belly, and she could fit into the palm of a child's hand. Her many other brothers and sisters were bigger and brighter colours, and so it would be very easy to miss this little bird with the big voice if you walked through the forest. She was, in a way, camouflaged, except for the one thing that made her extraordinary and unlike her siblings. So she could never be mistaken for any of the other birds, because you could never miss her voice. Oh, her voice was like the sound of clear and powerful crystal waterfalls and angels when she sang, and her power came from a love for God, for the Creator of all the earth and the heavens and the stars, which she could see from her little tree, her branch and nest. Oh, she knew God the Creator, and she knew that He was called I Am, and she thought of I Am. Gracie knew, and she was so big inside of her invisible self that when she thought of God, she was so filled with thanks and awe and love. And she knew that God loved her just the way she was. She was alive, and He knew everything about her. Even when she was very small and felt odd and not like the other birds, sometimes she didn't feel good enough to hang out with them because she was very plain and small. Until one day she finally saw the sun rise and the light fall down like stars, and song just burst out of her little body, out of her heart, in happiness. After that, Gracie was known in the forest as the little bird with the big voice. She sang so beautifully, so loudly, so passionately, that it was like a whole symphony in one, and all the creatures came to listen. So they too would come and gather in the mornings and start their day in thanks and praise to God, the Creator of all. Her voice moved anyone who heard her, and they would be moved to tears because her voice touched their heart and soul. So on this crisp spring day, the world was venturing out more into nature and the bright light, and there happened to be on the edge of the forest an old man, in his own little world, talking to himself as he walked, with a stick in one hand and a lunch bag over his shoulder, with his cheese and pickle sandwiches in the other. But today was a good day as the sun shone so bright. He decided he would go and find a bench that he used to sit and loved to eat his lunch on with his wife on the other side of the forest. It was good to get some fresh air, he told himself, as he took gentle strides, still muttering. He missed his wife, who was no longer with him, and he could hear the birds singing in the distance and the rustling of the trees and the leaves in the soft breeze. And there was the trickle of little streams of water flowing through. The old man walked on and noticed something in the air, a sound that was different, a sound that was not like the other birds. A sound that was more beautiful as the wind suddenly blew in his face and made him stop to catch his breath. Unbeknown to him, in the distance, he could hear Gracie, the little bird with the big voice. He tried to ignore it, not understanding at all the sounds, but he couldn't deny its beauty. As he walked on, it became louder and louder and affected him. He wasn't sure he'd heard anything quite so beautiful in his life, and he couldn't help himself but turn into the trees down another path to follow the sound. Now, most animals in the forest have strong hearing and senses, and they listen. They could hear the footsteps coming and the vibrations from the ground as the old man drew closer. And the animals ran away and hid. Some went into their homes and dens, some into the trees. But still it was so that most wild animals were afraid of man. And yet little Gracie the bird was so in her moment, her eyes closed, singing from the depths of her heart and thanking God for life, that she certainly didn't notice the animals or the audience had gone. And she certainly didn't notice as she stood on a low branch, because she was a little bird that was quite afraid of heights. She sang and sang and sang, and didn't notice the man standing there with tears in his eyes. She was absolutely lost in the moment, as the old man simply couldn't believe his eyes or ears. How could such a sound come from such a tiny little bird? And a little bird, it seemed, that was alone, just like him. The tears rolled down his eyes onto his cheeks, maybe uncried tears, and he was so touched that in that instant, as he looked around, he decided that he would take the little bird home with him. He wasn't really thinking of her in this impulsive moment, but he opened up his lunch bag, threw away his sandwiches, and he reached out and gently picked up the little bird, who still didn't notice him there, and he put her in his lunch bag. Still in that moment, and her own voice so big that it blocked out the sounds and the movement, she sang and sang with all her might until she gently closed her eyes and fell into a deep sleep, just as she always did after a performance before all. And the old man didn't even realize he was hungry any longer, and was now walking home as quickly as he could through the forest, down the path, and out of the park towards his home overlooking the edge of the forest. He hurried up the path, checked around to see if anyone was watching as he went, and through the front door into what would be now Gracie's new home. He found a little box that was big enough to keep her in and safe, laid tissues on the bottom, made some little holes in the top so that she could breathe and get some light, and he placed the lid of a jam jar with some water in and sealed it up. And then he thought and thought, I will go and buy a bird cage and some seed, little one, he said. And the little bird still lay exhausted in sleep. After some time, the old man returned with a bird cage and food, and she had to get used to her new home so she could see out of the window, out through the bars that looked like nothing she had ever seen. Poor little Gracie was very confused, and yet she did what she always did when she was afraid. She started singing, and there her days began in the new home of Mr. Sully, the old man. Now in the local village, Mr. Sully, the old man, was known for being not a friendly man. In fact, when people saw him coming, they would generally turn away or cross the road. They shut their doors or pretended they didn't see him, because many had tried to smile and say hello and offer to help him carry his shopping, only to be met with mumbling, shouting, or a hard stare. He was known in the village as Mr. Grumpy. The clock handle went round and round for many, many days, zoomed by, and Gracie found herself in the little white cage by the window with her water and seeds, and in the distance you could see across the park, onto the top of the trees down the valley, was the edge of the forest where she belonged. And she especially sang louder in the mornings when the sun rose and lit the top of the forest. Gracie never forgot who she was and why she was made. She was created to sing as a little bird with a big voice, and she loved God. And every morning she was the companion who woke up the old man with her beautiful heavenly singing. And without realizing, it was releasing the old man of sorrow and loneliness. And to him it was like a little miracle that made all the difference every day. He began to feel more cheerful than ever and not alone anymore. You see, the old man had been alone for over 20 years because his wife had passed away and he had no children, no other family members, and he was very lonely. He had some books and the news programs, the radio, the television, which was often just filled with sad news and troubles in the world. He would go to the local shop for necessities and food. And deep down inside, he knew this was not really living at all, but just existing day to day with no purpose. Mr. Sully was still in his own world in many ways and had not noticed how Gracie over the weeks had started to get tired. She faded a little bit more day by day. She was growing weaker, and this morning she didn't sing so loud. Her singing apparently quieter and quieter, yet the old man, Mr. Sully, started to notice less. He was more cheerful and wanted to do much more. He was changing and finding himself getting up feeling cheerful and positive, and decided from now on he will go for a walk, he will go and get his own morning papers and his fresh bread. And he entered this morning the local shop. He started to smile and say good morning to the people that had passed him by many times before. And the owner in the shop was most surprised when Mr. Sully smiled and said, "Hello, good morning, how are you?" What a shock! She had never seen this man smile or speak ever. In fact, she'd never seen his teeth at all. Mr. Sully started to be polite to the postman. He even let the children have their ball back if it landed in his garden, whereas before he wouldn't even answer the door, and if he saw them in the garden he would chase them away and scowl. Yes, Mr. Sully was not feeling so alone anymore, all thanks to Gracie's beautiful singing that transformed his world and outlook. Still, the clock hands were going round and round as the days passed again, and it happened that one day Mr. Sully was out at the shop and noticed a poster on the door advertising a games night at the local church hall. A games night, huh? A night where he could play bridge or rummy, chess, cards with all the local people. Tea and cakes would be served. Now, he had not played any games since his wife had died, and she loved to play games, and he remembered his lovely wife and what she would say. So in a brave moment, he decided he would go and not talk himself into staying home like he always used to. But still, he didn't notice Gracie in the window. that her singing had become less and less. She was so quiet. She sat on her perch and slept a little bit longer every day. And the days went by and he didn't notice the long gaps between any sound as she gazed out of the window, longing for the forest, the fresh air, the green, the light, and her family. And of course, the wind and the creation of the Creator that she always sang for. Alas, they were all fading from her memory, and she didn't completely stop singing, but she knew that deep down inside she was slowly dying. Now the evening came for the games night at the local church hall, and the old man, Mr. Sully, was very nervous as he decided to wear his best jumper and cap. He arrived at the hall, took a deep breath for courage as he opened the door. He'd not spoken to people for many years, and yet somehow inside he knew, I can do this. I'm changed. I'm ready to live again. And to him, he was no longer alone. He stepped in the hall and took off his hat and nodded at the shocked people with their wide mouths open, staring in disbelief. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Yet he smiled and looked so happy to be there, so everyone else smiled back at him, and somebody said, welcome, Mr. Sully. Please take a seat. What do you like to play? What's your game? He chuckled and smiled and said, Oh, I love a game of chess. Oh, very good, very good. Then you should have a game of chess with old Charlie over there. He's been looking for some new competition for quite a while. And there a new fresh chapter began for Mr. Sully, the grumpy, lonely old man who made new friends, and everybody realized that he wasn't Mr. Grumpy after all. He was just grieving his wife for a very long time. Isn't it funny how people can be wrong about each other? After that day, Mr. Sully was not home very much, and he would get up in the mornings, give Gracie her feed and water. She would sing as she could, quieter and quieter, which he didn't notice. Then he would go and meet his friends for bowling, for a cup of tea, or whatever was happening, and never notice the little bird with the big voice was fading away. But one day, Mr. Sully woke up with a little bit of a sniffle and a cold, and he realized he wasn't feeling so well today, so he wouldn't go out but rest. He was up, he made his morning tea, and he sat down on the chair and noticed how quiet it was. Something was different. Then he jumped up and noticed that he could see little Gracie, but she had her head down on the perch. She was trying to sing, but she couldn't get it out enough. It was like she had a sore throat. At first, Mr. Sully was frightened. Oh, are you sick too? He picked her up and looked at her. She was breathing fine, but she didn't move much, and he could see she hadn't been eating so much, and then he realized her eyes were sad. Oh no, oh no, what have I done? He said. Oh no. Mr. Sully grabbed his coat and hat and placed Gracie in her cage. He realized that he had been very selfish to take Gracie away from her forest and family and home. He had been very wrong all along about Gracie being alone too. He had taken her from her purpose, where she belonged, the place where she gave joy and had company. Immediately he picked up the little bird cage, covered it in a blanket, got his walking stick, and off he went, strolling through the park, through the forest, finding his way, trying to remember the spot where he found Gracie. And with tears in his eyes, he picked up the little bird and put her on a tree branch, and he said to her, I am truly sorry. Please forgive me for being so selfish and thinking only of myself and what made me feel better. You have been a wonderful, kind, beautiful companion. Thank you so much for bringing your song into my life. It's been like a new life. Please, please sing again. If you can, be free, because I will never forget you. Sing, little bird, sing. Oh, God in heaven, if you can hear me, help this little bird. Don't let her die. I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. And with tears running down his face, he took a deep breath of remorse and turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He walked and walked. It was still silent as he got very far away from the edge of the forest, and suddenly he heard the most beautiful singing again. Gracie, the little bird with the big voice, was singing at the top of her little lungs. She was home, singing in thanks and happiness to the Creator, to God. And Mr. Sully sighed in deep relief. The sun broke out through the clouds as he walked home the last part, and he looked up to heaven and said, "Thank you, God. Thank you." The end.